Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture. This is section 2.3, The Spread of the Reformation. Your objective for today is to explain how and why religious beliefs and practices changed from 1450 to 1648. So this is a continuation of the objective from the 2.2 lecture. However, I want you to answer this now with the context and the knowledge that you learn in 2.3. And the theme, like 2.2, is also going to be cultural and intellectual developments. So today we're going to learn about other reformers that will follow in Martin Luther's footsteps and offer their own interpretation of new Christian practice during the 16th century. We're going to start with what is known as the Zwinglian Reformation. This was really the first movement to emerge after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses and established the foundation for Protestantism, and he specifically, remember, will develop Lutheranism. So the Zwinglian Reformation began with the reformer Ulrich Zwingli, who was from Switzerland. Zwingli was strongly influenced by Christian humanism and the writings of Erasmus. He was also an ordained Catholic priest, so he was very familiar with traditional Catholic practice and scripture. And he was basically an early leader of the Reformation in Switzerland. And his ideas and his writings and popularity coincided with some early Swiss nationalism and the development of some early Swiss identity as well. Now, the city of Zurich became the center of the Zwinglian Reformation. At this time, Switzerland was a confederation of about 13 self-governing cantons. Think of them as sort of like counties. Switzerland was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it did not have powerful princes that ruled with independence. So the Swiss tended to be more closely tied to urban areas. Zwingli began preaching Reformation theology in the city of Zurich, which initially caused lots of controversy, but would actually lead to a debate that Zwingli won that helped to legitimize his preaching and his teaching. This allowed Zwingli to continue his preaching as he was now supported by the city government of Zurich. And this is significant because this starts to establish an important tradition or precedent within Reformed religions in Switzerland in particular. So because the city government of Zurich now supported Zwingli, this sets the precedent of a state-supervised church. And we will see that continue with our next Swiss reformer, John Calvin. Basically, with a state-supervised church, the state was able to establish a tribunal of clergy and secular officers that enforced discipline among the faithful of Zurich. So again, we had a state-supervised church that became very concerned with people's behavior and morality. So let's look at some of the key elements of Zwinglian doctrine. It actually shared many similar reforms as Lutheranism. Many of Luther's ideas will become defining characteristics for almost every aspect of Protestantism. For example, there was no more monasticism, no more pilgrimages, no veneration of saints, no clerical celibacy, no papal authority, and only scriptural authority. So that idea that the Bible is the sole authority. Zwingli also emphasized simplicity in worship. So a very stripped down, bare bones, simple service. This also represents the growth of something called iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, I-C-O-N-O-C-L-A-S-M. Iconoclasm is the stripping of images and altar decorations from churches. So there would be no decorations, no images in the church. And the reason behind this is because this was not present in the Bible. The Bible did not state that churches needed to be full of fancy decorations and images. This also meant that music was eliminated from church service. Now, this element of simplicity does become more unique to the Reformed religions of Zwingli and later Calvin. Luther actually really enjoyed having music as part of his church service, and Luther himself composed many hymns. Also, Zwingli did not believe that people were able to monitor their own morality, hence the creation of that city tribunal. Now, this tribunal, which, like I said, was made up of clergy and secular officers, monitored the behavior and the morality of the people of Zurich, and they actually had the power to excommunicate people from this new church if they strayed from community beliefs. And we will see that John Calvin and Calvinism will continue many of these traditions from Zwingli. Now, one important event in the development of the early Protestant Reformation was an event known as the Colloquy at Marburg. Colloquy is a fancy word for debate. So the debate at Marburg, which was a city in the Holy Roman Empire. This was a debate between Luther and Zwingli in an attempt to unify and to promote the Lutheran and Swiss churches, right? Because Luther and Zwingli were contemporaries of one another. Many Protestant political leaders were actually urging this alliance because they were fearful that Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, would take advantage of divisions between the reformers and use that to weaken or crush the Protestant movement. Now, many things seemed to, come to go okay, and they came to many agreements: no monasticism, no papal authority, but they did have a fundamental difference over the Lord's Supper, which is one of the sacraments that does remain in Protestantism. And they disagreed whether there was a symbolic or literal presence of Christ at this communion. And this actually became such a point of disagreement that the debate and any possible alliance basically broke down. So there was no alliance, no agreement, no unification between the churches of Zwingli and Luther, just because of this one disagreement in the theology of the communion. Now, a few years later, there would be some religious wars in Switzerland. These are part of the many religious wars that will take place in the 16th century. This more in particular was a civil war within Switzerland between Protestant and Catholic territories. Now, Zwingli himself, a leader of the Protestants, actually led the Protestant forces into the battle armed with a sword and a Bible, and he was then promptly killed in the battle. This did not bring an end to the Reform movement in Switzerland, however. We will see that it will continue with John Calvin, who we'll learn about momentarily. However, one interesting point is that when Luther heard about Zwingli's death in battle, Luther, who was still bitter over that colloquy at Marburg, supposedly said that Zwingli, quote, got what he deserved. And like I said, Zwingli's ideas will continue, and they will basically be absorbed into Calvinism, which becomes a much more prominent and dominant form of Protestantism in Switzerland and across Europe. The next group we're going to talk about are the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists. And the Anabaptists were considered the radical reform movement of the Protestant Reformation. Other Protestants and Catholics all thought these guys were crazy, basically. So they were the radical reform movement. The reason they were considered radical is because they practiced adult baptism. So in general, I just want you to know that while most Protestant sects rejected the 7 sacraments, many of them retained the basic 2 of baptism and communion. All right, so many Protestant groups would still support baptism because baptism did exist in the Bible with Christ and John the Baptist, right? So anyways, like I said, one of the things that made the Anabaptists so radical is that they only supported adult baptism, not infant baptism like everyone else. And this is because Anabaptists believed that only adults could manifest true faith and therefore be worthy of baptism. I should also mention that this group emerged as sort of an offshoot of some of Zwingli's original followers, right? So while most of Zwingli's ideas and followers are absorbed into Calvinism, a couple of the more radical ones develop what is known as Anabaptism. Anabaptists also believed that no one should be forced to accept the truth of the Bible. They believed in a community of equal believers as well, so no church hierarchy. And this also meant that they supported simple Christian living, and they lived in very independent communities. They did not accept secular government, which also meant they refused to pay taxes, they refused to serve in the army, they refused to hold public office, and they refused to bear arms. So you can start to see why other groups may not approve of the Anabaptists. There's sort of their theological radical ideas like adult baptism, but then also if they don't acknowledge a secular state and don't pay taxes, you can see why many secular rulers would not approve of this religious practice. Still, Anabaptism was very attractive to peasants and laborers in particular. Now, like I mentioned, the Anabaptists were considered radical, and therefore they were targeted by both Protestants and Catholics. The early Anabaptists who had followed part of Zwingli's teaching had actually been expelled from Zurich and had to find other places to live. And Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, while he hated all forms of Protestantism, he especially detested Anabaptism. And he specifically declared that Anabaptism was a crime punishable by death, and the preferred form of execution was drowning of these Anabaptists. Anabaptists would also be heavily persecuted after an event known as the German Peasants' War, which takes place in the 1520s, and we'll learn about that in a later lecture in this unit. But basically, everybody hated the Anabaptists, and it was difficult for them to find acceptance, which is one of the things that led to the craziness that would take place in the city of Munster, which saw the development of some super radical ideas known as Millennialism. All right. So Munster, I should want to say, is a city in what is basically modern-day Germany, at the time the Holy Roman Empire. And Millennialism is not specific to Anabaptism per se, but it's this really radical belief that the end of the world is nigh and the apocalypse is coming, right? So sometimes we see this in more radical religious cults and things like that. So the city of Munster had actually converted to Lutheranism in 1532. But that also because it was one of the first cities to convert to Lutheranism or any form of Protestantism, this created some religious chaos and hysteria within the city that actually led the city government to formally recognize Anabaptists, right? And remember, Anabaptists were not welcome in many other places. They were persecuted mostly by both Protestants and Catholics. So this meant that the city of Munster became a haven for especially some of these more radical Anabaptists. And those radical Anabaptists really began to flock to the city of Munster, and they considered Munster to be their, quote, New Jerusalem. And as they sort of rose to power within the city government, they decided to enact laws and policies such as abolishing private property, abolishing the use of money, and even allowing for the practice of polygamy. So, as you can see, even for the Anabaptists, these guys who were in the city of Munster were considered very radical. Very, very radical. And of course, they believed that all of this was because the end of the world was coming soon. Now, obviously, this is going to lead to even more persecution, lots of concerns about the city of Munster, because there were many people in Munster who were not these radical Anabaptists and did not like what was happening to their city. So in 1535, the city was basically recaptured by an alliance of Catholic and Lutheran forces. Again, while Catholics and Lutherans disagree on many things, they did agree that they hated the Anabaptists, and they brutally murdered the Anabaptist leaders. So much so that the mutilated corpses of these original Anabaptist leaders who led this sort of uprising in Munster still hang in iron cages on the church in Munster, and that's the photo that you see here. So in the upper left corner, you can see those 3 cages. Those were the cages, and you can also see them in that red circle to the right. These are the cages that held the corpses of those radical Anabaptist leaders as a warning to other Anabaptists, or really any other radical reformer, that the city of Munster was not going to tolerate that type of behavior in the future. Now, aside from this crazy episode of Munster, most Anabaptists actually were fairly pacifistic and not as antagonistic in trying to create this sort of new apocalyptic Jerusalem, right? Most Anabaptists would actually find refuge in the Netherlands, which allows for the development of Dutch Anabaptism, which would become known as the Mennonites. And the Mennonites, you can think of them as they're very similar to the Amish in a lot of ways. They emphasized pacifism, a very simple Christian living designed to emulate the life of Christ. This was really more of a peaceful, evangelical form of Anabaptism that was promoted by the reformer Menno Simons. Menno, M-E-N-N-O, Simons, S-I-M-O-N. And that's why they're called the Mennonites. Now, many Mennonites would eventually leave Europe and settle in the Americas, especially in North America. And they also sort of, from this group, we would see the development of the Amish as well. And both the Mennonites and the Amish were considered religious minorities within Europe, which is why many of them migrated to the New World to find more religious freedom and opportunity. Moving on now to John Calvin and the development of Calvinism. Next to Martin Luther and Lutheranism, John Calvin and his Calvinism is probably the most important and influential of all of the new Protestant religions. So John Calvin is considered to be part of the second generation of reformers. Luther and Zwingli are part of the first. Calvin had received a diverse education in humanistic studies, especially in Northern humanism. And he was originally French. I remember France was a very Catholic country, and France will do their best to remain a Catholic country all throughout the 16th century, and we'll learn more about that situation later. But anyways, earlier in his life, in about 1533, Calvin supposedly experienced a religious crisis that led to his conversion and his ideas that would come to form the basis of Calvinism. However, France was not friendly to Protestant reformers or Protestant practitioners, and so he relocated to Geneva, Switzerland, another city in Switzerland, which had more acceptance of Protestantism, especially because of the foundation of Zwingli's ideas about a decade or two earlier than that. So John Calvin will write a book called The Institutes of Christian Religion, where he outlines his beliefs and the ideas that become the foundation of Calvinism. Now, like other forms of Protestantism, there will be many basic similarities to Lutheranism, such as the idea of justification by faith and not good works, deny papal authority, deny monasticism, deny saints, and the Bible is the sole authority. So a lot of that was very similar to Luther's original ideas. However, John Calvin had a much more pessimistic view of human nature than Luther. He believed that salvation came through obedience to faith. So yes, it was still ultimately dependent on the individual, hence that idea of sort of individualism from the Renaissance. You can see that influence here. But at the same time, that salvation came through obedience to the faith. This leads to one of the key characteristics of Calvinism, and this is something you need to write down. And that is the idea of predestination. Predestination. We'll get into that more in the next bullet point here. But predestination basically emphasizes that idea that someone has to be obedient to the faith. And John Calvin also believed that there was a need for the church to monitor the faithful, right? He believed that people needed to have their behavior and their morality monitored by the church. So you can see there's a lot of influence from Zwingli's ideas into Calvinism. Calvin also emphasized the almightiness of God. And so this emphasis on the almightiness of God combined with this idea of how salvation came through obedience to the faith led to, again, the key characteristic of Calvinism, which is predestination. So we're on that third bullet point now. Basically, Calvin believed that God had predestined some people to be saved, what we would call the elect, and others to be damned. So basically, God had chosen, whoever he decided was worthy to be saved, and everyone else would be damned. Okay, so the chosen few, basically. Part of the reason Calvin has this belief, like I said, is because he was a severe critic of human nature, and he honestly believed that not everyone deserved to be saved. Now, the obvious question is here is, how do you know? How would you know if you are one of the chosen few, according to Calvinism? Well, Calvin believed that there were 3 tests that could indicate possible salvation. First was an open profession of faith, specifically the faith of Calvinism, living a decent and godly life, of course, according to the expectations of Calvinism, and also participation in the sacraments of baptism and communion within the Calvinist church, right? So an open profession of faith, a decent and godly life, and participation of the sacraments of baptism and communion. And of course, this all had to be within the context of the Calvinist church. However, even if someone passed these 3 tests initially, there was no guarantee of salvation, right? There's no guarantee. They had to maintain that obedience to the faith throughout their lifetime in order to be saved. So this is why Calvinism is sometimes viewed as a more militant and also actually a more international form of Protestantism. It would spread to France, and in France, Calvinists were known as the Huguenots. And I'm going to spell that for you because I want you to write it down. So in France, Calvinists were known as the Huguenots, Huguenots. In Scotland, it became known as the Presbyterian Church. And again, I'm going to spell that for you. So in Scotland, it became known as the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian. It also spread to England. In England, Calvinists were known as Puritans, Puritans, and it also became very, very popular in the Netherlands, which doesn't have a specific name. They're just sort of Dutch Calvinists. It would also spread to parts of Poland, parts of the United States and Canada, and even parts of Hungary in Eastern Europe. Now, Calvinists were very devout. They were very supportive of their religion. They were convinced that they were doing God's work on earth. And so Calvinism was considered to be one of the more aggressive forms of Protestantism and actually saw the most conversions to Calvinism, right? So more people overall would convert to Calvinism than any other form of Protestantism. Calvinists also refused to see the subordination of the church to the state. They believed that the state was above the church, much like Zwingli did. And like Zwingli, Calvinism had very simple, stark church services. So no decorations, no images, right? So that practice of iconoclasm, no music, very simple, solemn church service with very long, serious sermons. Now, the heart of Calvinism became the city of Geneva in Switzerland. Geneva actually became a theocracy based on Calvinism. A theocracy is what we call sort of a church and state combination. But Geneva became known as this model Christian community, and reformers from across Europe flocked to Geneva to learn from Calvin and his teachings. Geneva developed what was essentially a church government, so there was no separation of church and state. And this church government created a strict moral code that was severely enforced, right? Again, the intention here was to monitor people's behavior and morality. And punishment could include public punishment, banishment, or even excommunication from the Calvinist church. This church government also required public confession of sins as a way to hold people accountable. And they also eliminated frivolous activities such as dancing, music, card playing, drinking alcohol, or swearing, right? So all of those fun things were either completely banned or severely limited in the city of Geneva because they were seen as immoral activities within the Calvinist church. Calvinism also was not very tolerant of other religious minorities or dissenters, right? So they either persecuted or banished other religions from their community. But still, this was seen as a vibrant center of Protestantism, which, like I said, was visited by many other reformers who would spread Calvinism to other parts of Europe. One example of that is a man named John Knox, and John Knox is spelled Knox, and John Knox is the person who would bring Calvinism to Scotland, which was formerly a Catholic territory, and introduced the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. Now we are on to the very fun and exciting English Reformation, our last topic in today's lecture. This is where we get to learn all about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So the English Reformation is what would lead to the creation of the Anglican Church, all right, or what we will call Anglicanism. So Anglicanism, A-N-G-L-I-S-M. Oh, wait, no, A-N-G-L-I-C-A-N-I-S-M, Anglicanism. Sorry about that. Okay, and this is a specifically very nationalistic church that is specific to England, because unlike Luther and Calvin, we will see that the English Reformation is motivated more by politics than by theology. So it all began when Henry VIII, the King of England, wanted to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon and marry another woman named Anne Boleyn. Now, Catherine of Aragon was one of the daughters of the famous Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. She was also a very devout Catholic. Interesting backstory here. Catherine had originally been engaged to Henry's older brother Arthur, who was intended to be the next king of England, but shortly after Catherine and Arthur were married, Arthur died. And Henry's father, who was Henry VII, the new monarch, wanted to maintain this important alliance with Spain, so he had Catherine marry his other son, Henry VIII. Well, this in and of itself was a little controversial because you're generally not supposed to marry your brother's widow. And so, even to approve this marriage, they had to get special permission from the Pope, which he granted because he recognized the political necessity of the situation. Anyway, fast forward a few decades, Henry VIII and Catherine have been married, and they have only produced one living child, a daughter named Mary, and no sons, no male heir. And Henry VIII was very concerned about this, about not having a son. He needed a male heir to inherit the throne. This was this part of his his identity, part of his legacy. He had to have a son. And there was some practical reasoning here too. The War of the Roses, which had only been fought a few decades earlier, was largely caused by disagreements over a rightful heir to the throne, right? So there was a need for Henry to have a son to maintain political stability and continuity of the Tudor dynasty. Anyways, over time, Henry gets tired of Catherine, and he says, I need a male heir. Catherine can't produce one for whatever reason. He actually believed that his marriage was cursed because he had married his brother's widow. And around the same time, this new young noblewoman at court named Anne Boleyn caught Henry's eye. But Anne refused to just be Henry's mistress. She basically said, if you want it, you got to put a ring on it. She wanted to be queen. Also, Anne and her family were early Protestants, right? So she's going to be kind of whispering into Henry's ear about some of the values of Protestantism through this time. Now, what's ironic in all of this is Henry was actually a very religious, conservative Catholic for much of his early life in particular. When he had heard about Luther's 95 Theses, he actually condemned them. And he wrote a treatise with Thomas More condemning Luther and other Protestant ideas. And this was actually so effective that the Pope at the time named Henry Defender of the Faith, right? So again, this shows us that the English Reformation is motivated by politics and, frankly, Henry's desire to have a son, and not motivated by theology like we would see in the other Reformations. Anyways, Henry wants to divorce Catherine and marry Anne, but the whole reason he can't do this is because Catholics don't allow divorce. So if he wanted a divorce, he had to appeal to the Pope, who at the time was Clement VII. Now, the Pope had the ability to technically grant a divorce, which we would call an annulment, not a divorce. And the Pope recognized, that there were these political needs of monarchs to produce children, and sometimes marriages in that sense didn't work out. However, the timing here is really, really bad, because this request was made in about 1527, which is the same year that Charles V and his Spanish armies had invaded and sacked and pillaged the city of Rome. And Charles V was basically holding the Pope hostage in Rome. I should also mention, in case you didn't recognize it already, Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and like Catherine, very Catholic and a staunch defender of Catholicism. And Charles V was, of course, trying to control the spread of the Reformation. So the Pope denied this divorce to Henry VIII, the King of England. Well, of course, Henry VIII was outraged. Who can tell him who he can and cannot marry, right? Why does the Pope have this much control, not only over his personal life, but over his kingdom, over his legacy, right? So ultimately, Henry's motivation here is he no longer wants to listen to the Pope. He no longer wants to be under the jurisdiction and the control of the Pope. So he orders Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, basically the highest level clergyman in England, to grant the annulment or the divorce. And that was just in the nick of time, too, because it turned out that Anne Boleyn was already pregnant at this point, but they were married in time for her to give birth to not a son, but a daughter. And her daughter was named Elizabeth, and that would become Elizabeth I, the later fabulous Queen of England. Now, after the annulment, Catherine of Aragon was stripped of her titles. She was sent away from court to live in a monastery, and their daughter, Mary, was declared illegitimate. So this was a huge scandal, basically, that rocked Europe, that Henry VIII cast aside Catherine of Aragon from Spain. He disowned his daughter. There's a huge scandal, and it also was very shameful for Catherine and Mary. All right. Now, in the establishment of his new Protestant church, the Anglican Church, Henry wants to make sure that everyone in England is going to listen to him and follow these new rules. So he's going to ask Parliament to pass a law called the Act of Supremacy in 1534. The Act of Supremacy is what basically formally established the Anglican Church and also declared the King of England the taken, accepted, and reputed the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. All right, so basically in the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, they have replaced the Pope with the King. So this meant now that the English monarch was in charge of doctrine, so like what the church believed. They were in charge of clerical appointments. They were in charge of discipline. They held many roles similar to the Pope, but they were basically a theological and secular ruler in one. All right, so the Act of Supremacy establishes the Church of England and establishes the king as the head of that church, much like the Pope. Now, like I said, Henry wanted to make sure that everyone's going to listen to him, everyone's going to follow these new rules, so he then followed up with the Treason Act, or the Act of Succession, another law passed by Parliament. And this law said that it was punishable by death to deny that the king was the head of the church. All right, so if you did not acknowledge that the king was the head of the church, you could be executed. And he required everyone, especially everyone at court, to take an oath swearing their loyalty to Henry and their acceptance, acknowledging him as the head of the Church of England. Now, this is where he comes into conflict with Thomas More. You might remember Thomas More as a famous Christian humanist, a friend of Erasmus, but also a devout Catholic. And Thomas More, despite being a humanist, did not support the Protestant Reformation. And he also refused to compromise his Catholic faith. But he realized that with the new Church of England and with the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Succession, that his loyalty to the Pope was considered treason. But regardless, he refused to take the oath. He refused to acknowledge Henry as the new leader of the Church of England. And as a result, Henry had no choice but to execute Thomas More, who had been one of his closest friends and advisors. Now, long story short, Thomas More does eventually become a saint within the Catholic Church for his martyrdom and his commitment to the Catholic faith. So, another action notable by Henry VIII is the dissolution of monasteries across England. So this is one way in which Anglicanism is similar to other forms of Protestantism, is that they eliminate monasticism. But again, the motivation is not theological as it is maybe so much political or economic. So in 1536, Henry VIII ordered hundreds of religious houses to be closed all across England. And the land that those monasteries owned were confiscated by the king and sold to members of the nobility or the gentry or other merchants. And this actually greatly expanded the landed aristocracy in England, which of course created more loyalty to the monarchy and in turn expanded the power of the monarchy. The monarchy also was able to acquire a lot of the wealth that had been hoarded in these monasteries. So that was another motivating factor, because monasteries were seen, of course, as being very Catholic. So Henry wanted to get rid of them for that reason. He wanted to give the land to noblemen so the noblemen would support him, and he wanted the wealth that had been stored in those monasteries. So overall, I would like to say that Anglicanism, or the Church of England, is what I like to call Diet Catholicism, right? When we actually look at what the theological foundations are and the characteristics are. Because since this was a politically motivated Reformation and not a theological or spiritual motivated Reformation, the Church of England actually retained many qualities of Catholicism. It still had a clerical hierarchy with the monarch at the top and archbishops and bishops. It still had more sacraments. It still had a lot of the ritual and fanciness that we would see in the Catholic Church, and consider how that was very different to, say, a Calvinist church. And also, members of the clergy were still celibate, meaning they did not get married and have children. In 1536, Henry issued the 10 Articles, which affirmed some of the essential characteristics of Lutheran reform as well. So, salvation by faith alone, limiting it to 3 sacraments, and also rejecting Catholic concepts like purgatory and the cult of saints. So it's still mostly Catholic in a lot of ways, but still incorporated some basic ideas of Protestantism, and still maintained, like I said, some of that Orthodox Catholic doctrine, like clerical celibacy, clerical hierarchy, and the communion. Now, under later monarchs, the Church of England would become more theologically Protestant, especially as Protestantism became more popular and accepted among English society. All right. Now, of course, the thing Henry is really well known for is having 6 wives. Not at one time, however. He wasn't a polygamist, but over the course of his life, he had 6 different wives. And it was the first 2 wives that were closely associated with the start of the Reformation. Now, you're never going to be asked about these wives in a real exam or anything like that, but it's a fascinating history and story, and so I will take a moment to tell you about these 6 queens of England. We know that the first wife was Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and Henry divorced her so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. So we're going from left to right on the top here. The first one is Catherine. The next one was Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was really the big motivation behind the English Reformation. But, of course, she gave birth to a daughter after they were married, which was very disappointing. And she also started to become a little annoying, according to Henry, because she wanted to be more involved with the leadership of England. She was very Protestant and wanted to see more changes to the church. Basically, she didn't really know her place. And so Henry's advisors basically framed her for adultery, right, for cheating on Henry with another man. And of course, the punishment for adultery for a woman, and a queen in particular, is death. And so Anne Boleyn would be beheaded and executed for the crime of adultery. Did she actually commit adultery? No one really knows. It was a convenient excuse for Henry to get rid of her. After Anne, Henry married a noblewoman named Jane Seymour, who you can see on the upper right there. Jane Seymour is said to be Henry's favorite wife for many reasons, but also most notably because she gave birth to a son. She is the one woman who will give birth to a son. This son will become Edward VI. But even though she gave birth to a son, it was a very traumatic pregnancy and birth, and Jane died shortly after. Henry was heartbroken by this, heartbroken to lose his beloved Jane. I will also mention that when Henry dies, he is buried next to Jane in Westminster Abbey. That's how much he liked her. So Henry is devastated by Jane's death. He doesn't want to consider another wife, but his son is somewhat sickly and ill, and so his advisors pressure him to consider a new wife. And he's like, sure, okay, do whatever you want. So his advisors in England decide to arrange a marriage with a Protestant noblewoman from Germany, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves, Cleves. And this was an arranged marriage, and so Henry only saw a portrait of her before the actual marriage ceremony, or before she arrived in England. And when she arrived, Henry decided that she was so hideous, he actually called her a horse face, that he couldn't, really do this marriage. And so they actually had a divorce shortly after the marriage. After that, Henry's like, okay, this is ridiculous. I'm the King of England. I want someone young and pretty and sexy. And so then he marries another English noblewoman named Catherine Howard. And yes, there is a pattern with names here. Catherine Howard. She was a young, exuberant, feisty English noblewoman who was several decades younger than Henry, and she would also be executed for adultery. And maybe she actually did commit it, because can you really blame her at this point? The last wife was Catherine Parr, P-A-R-R, and Catherine Parr would survive. She would actually outlive Henry, and she actually convinced Henry to acknowledge and re-legitimize his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, from his first two wives, and include them in the line of succession again. So again, the six wives were Catherine of Aragon, who was divorced, Anne Boleyn, who died, Jane Seymour, who died, Anne of Cleves, who he divorced, Catherine Howard, who died, and Catherine Parr, who survived. Now, moving forward, Henry's Reformation will continue to an extent with his children. His son, Edward VI, who you see here, will briefly rule after the death of Henry, but Edward himself was in poor health, so his reign only lasted a few years. He is then succeeded by his older sister, Mary. Mary, of course, was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and she had been raised very, very Catholic, and she was very resentful of the whole Reformation and the way her mother and she had been treated. So when she became queen, she wanted revenge, and she did everything she could to return England to Catholicism. She persecuted Protestant leaders. It's said that she executed more than 300 Protestant leaders by burning them at the stake for heresy, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. She also would marry Philip II of Spain, who happened to also be her first cousin, in an attempt to create an alliance between two Catholic monarchs. But this was a very unpopular move, because by this point in the century, England had really come to hate Spain because of political rivalry and differences in competition. And so Mary herself was not a very popular monarch, because by the 1550s, much of England had accepted Protestantism. It had converted to Protestantism. And Mary's attempt to revert to Catholicism was unwelcomed by the English people. And Protestantism actually was identified with English resistance to Spanish interference. Protestantism had started to become closely intertwined with English identity. Now, Mary only lived for 5 years as queen before she died, and she was succeeded by her younger sister, Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Now, ironically, Elizabeth I becomes the great, capable, competent, successful monarch that Henry had hoped for. And Elizabeth is known as a politique because of the way she is able to mitigate and limit religious conflict in preference of political stability. So when Elizabeth came to power, she had to restore the Anglican Church after the sort of chaos caused by her sister Mary. And so she retained some aspects of the medieval church, such as the clerical hierarchy with bishops and archbishops, the court system, the practice of tithes or taxes, the structure of the parish, right? So there's some Catholic structure that she retains, but she also makes sure to define some Protestant religious practice with, the idea of salvation by faith alone, getting rid of the monasteries, getting rid of the cult of saints and purgatory. She also made English the official language of the church, not Latin, and even allowed the clergy to marry and no longer be celibate. But this also is considered to be a state church because the monarch is still the head of the church, and the monarch could therefore determine doctrine by acting through parliament. So technically you could say this was a theocracy, but it didn't have the same insanity as we would see, say, in Geneva under Calvinism, right? Elizabeth acknowledged that, yes, while she was the head of the church, she wasn't going to behave like a pope or a spiritual leader. Really, there might be suggestions for doctrine by the higher level clergy that she would approve, and it would be passed by parliament. Now, one of the more important documents that Elizabeth would issue in sort of defining the Anglican Church was something known as the 39 Articles. The 39 Articles, which was passed by Parliament in 1563. This document would outline much of the theology and belief of Anglicanism, or the Church of England. And Elizabeth notably and purposefully made the doctrine very broad and ambiguous in order to prevent conflict within England, right? Because she valued political stability over religious conformity. However, her religious toleration did have some limits, right? She wanted to be tolerant. However, she did not put up with Catholics who threatened her authority, and there's going to be many Catholic supporters who do not view Elizabeth as a legitimate queen and do not approve of her because she's a woman, because she's a Protestant. However, she went after them more so because their actions were considered treasonous and not so much that they were considered to be, just Catholic, right? But still, because she prioritized political stability over, religious conformity, this is why she is called a politique. And we will learn more about Elizabeth later, but Elizabeth's, kind of establishment of a solid church early in her reign is what allows her to initiate this period of stability and prosperity in England. You can see that she rules for several decades. She is one of the most famous and successful monarchs in all of English history. This is a period frequently referred to as the English Renaissance, when Shakespeare is writing and culture is flourishing. So like I said, Elizabeth I, really the greatest monarch of the Tudor dynasty and the one who really helped to solidify England in the early modern era. All right, that is it for section 2.3. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for our next lecture, 2.4.